Every country has one. Australia's is Canberra, a capital breathtaking in its ambition, striking in its design, and glorious in the lifestyle it affords its residents, even if they're sometimes misunderstood beyond the limits of this city. Well, this day is for them, all 420,000 residents of the ACT, who now get to decide how their city is managed, cared for, educated, protected from pandemic, and prosperous into the future. Now, 2020 marks 31 years since that wobbly notion of self-government was first put to the test with voters. They haven't always loved it, yet dutifully they support it in a vibrant and competitive election process that comes around every 4 years. Live from the magnificent National Museum of Australia, some questions will be answered tonight. Does this city stick with the Labor-led governments it's known for nigh on 2 decades? Or does it do as it did 25 years ago and elect a hybrid minority dominated by Liberals? Well, the answers will come, and quickly too, tonight on ACT Votes 2020. Hello and welcome to the Gandel Atrium of the National Museum of Australia on Acton Peninsula here in Canberra. I'm Greg Jennett, and tonight we'll bring you the results of an election that's been keenly contested by 137 candidates vying for the 25 seats in the 10th ACT Legislative Assembly. Now, in just under 30 minutes from now, polling places will close, and the 300,000 voters who should have cast a ballot in this election will have done so. So between now and then, we'll bring you insights and analysis from our team here, but also from our reporters and ABC News crews who are fanned out around the city at party gatherings. But first, to understand where this election will be won and lost, the ABC's chief election analyst, Anthony Green, is back with us in the capital. And Anthony, take us through the Assembly arithmetic. What is the starting position tonight?
Well, there are 25 seats in the ACT's Legislative Assembly. That's the chamber. If we look at the state of the current parliament, remember there's been 10 elections and only one has produced majority government. The current chamber has 11 Liberals on the opposition, 12 Labor members and 2 Greens holding the balance of power. And as has been occurring a number of times since self-government is a Labor-Green government of some sort of agreement. At the moment, it's a coalition government. Can the Liberals gain an extra seat or two to get into government? The difficulty the Liberals have had in the last 20 years is there been no other party in the chamber. Every crossbench that's been elected has been more Labor-leaning, where Kate Carnell had a number of Conservative crossbench members. So that'll be interesting to watch if anybody else can get on the crossbench or if the Liberal Party can gain some extra seats.
Yep, that's the mathematics. The magic number's 13 if anyone is to achieve a majority. Now, just briefly, we wanted to note at the outset that Anthony's intending to keep across not one, but 2 elections tonight, the other being in New Zealand. So same question again, Anthony. What is the starting position in the race for power in the Beehive?
Well, I know some people have been saying we should be covering the New Zealand election, but the ABC has a charter, unfortunately, as is horrible. But what's going to happen with the New Zealand election, unfortunately, it's not going to come up for me. Sure. The Labor Party is reliant currently in New Zealand on having Winston Peters holding the balance of power in the parliament. It's expected that he will lose his seats in parliament, and it will come down to Labor whether they get a majority or not. And it's not expected that the Nationals will be able to win this election. OK, we'll keep an eye on that, and Anthony will get all these graphics and figures back on that screen in due course. Now, in this impressive atrium of the National Museum, we've assembled a panel of analysts and MLAs who will try to
tease out the story behind the numbers that Anthony's giving us. So bringing his vast knowledge and experience is Adam Shirley, presenter of ABC Radio Canberra's Mornings program, and no one has interviewed more of the key players than has Adam, both over the course of the campaign, but also over the life of the now ending Assembly. Labor MLA Health Minister and recontesting Labor candidate for the seat of Kurrajong, Rachel Stephen-Smith. Thanks for joining us, Rachel. From the Liberal team, Vicki Dunn, who's bowing out tonight after a mammoth 19-year stretch in the Assembly. Thanks for coming back again, Vicki. And from the Greens, MLA and Cabinet Minister Shane Rattenbury. Shane, welcome. He could, once again, be a key player depending how the numbers finally fall tonight. But let's go to you first. Adam, what electorates and within them, which seats will you be watching most closely tonight?
JJ, I think Murrumbidgee, Yerrabee and Ginninderra, that fifth seat in those three electorates is probably where it will be decided this evening, and it's where most doubt might fall when it comes to the final result. I think it will be interesting, though, Greg, to see where thousands of votes from 2016 go from minor parties that were around at that time, a couple of independents as well. That's thousands of votes that have to land somewhere, and they could be crucial in the final result too. All
right, we'll keep an eye on that. Rachel, I won't ask you about Kurrajong, which is your own seat, because looking more broadly at the government and the ALP, I want to ask you about incumbency. How conscious are you heading into this, that we've been through a pandemic, and it must surely be assumed as a positive for Labor at present?
Well, I think there is that. I mean, this has clearly been a COVID election in many ways, and I want to start by thanking Elections ACT for the incredible job that they have done in managing a 3-week pre-poll, encouraging everyone to pre-poll. It's been absolutely outstanding. But I think incumbency is also interesting in relation to this election in how different it is to the 2016 election. Obviously, in 2016, the Assembly expanded from 17 to 25 members. There were effectively 8 empty seats plus a retiring member, so 9 empty seats. That's not been the case this time. We've only got 2 retiring members. So incumbency will be important in terms of experience in government, but also in terms of the individuals that get elected.
Right down to individual candidates, including yourself. Vicki Dunn, you've sat on ABC election night broadcasts before, and they haven't ended happily for the Liberals. What's going to work this time around?
Look, we all know, Greg, that, and Anthony touched on this, that the road to victory for the Liberals is a very narrow road. There aren't really recognisable parties that we can coalesce with or partner with in the way that the Labor Party has with the Greens. You effectively have a coalition. So we recognise that everything has to go right for us and that we are looking at, and our strategy has to be, for the most part, a strategy for majority government. And no, I mean, as Anthony said, there's only been one majority government in the past, and there has never been a Liberal majority government. If Alastair pulls this off, he will be a hero of the Liberal Party forever.
We'll have plenty of time to talk about that strategy, win, lose or draw as the night goes on. And finally, to you, Shane Rattenbury, you're going in with yourself and one other MLA. Your assessment of the difficulty of making up for something that Rachel's already addressed, and that is incumbency with the retirement of Caroline Lekucha.
Yes, Caroline's been a terrific member of the Assembly over a couple of terms now, and obviously whenever you lose a sitting member, it does make it harder to retain the seat, particularly in this Hare-Clark system where personal recognition is such an important factor. And going to Adam's earlier point, these electorates are decided on very fine margins, often just a couple of hundred votes, and it really is the 5th seat in each electorate which determines the outcome. And so they will be the key seats to look at tonight. We're certainly hopeful to increase our numbers. It's quite challenging being just 2 in the Assembly and having to cover all of the issues and be in that central balance of power point with the deciding votes.
Well, challenges are plenty across all of the parties. We'll keep across those, of course, in all our discussions tonight. But we do want to recap, because although COVID-19 threatened to interrupt this election, actually having a fixed date every 4 years means the parties could gear up for a long run towards this day. The ACT also has adopted this idea of a 3-week voting period rather than just a single election day, and that creates the need for parties to define their issues much earlier and then to deliver the almost endless lists of policies and promises on offer that come with campaigns. So our reporter, Susan McDonald, looks back on the issues, the offerings, and some of the points of conflict too in Campaign 2020.
Forged in fire, Andrew Barr ushered in the election year managing a crisis not of his making. Thick smoke blanketed the city and flames loomed over the southern tip in Canberra's worst fire threat since 2003. Here at ESA headquarters, it was a hive of activity. The Chief Minister gave daily media briefings with a captive audience on social media. In the end, the city was spared, but a greater challenge lay ahead. COVID came to Canberra. Streets emptied and the health system wound down to the bare minimum. Under Labor, emergency department and elective surgery wait times have remained stubbornly poor. The government announced funding to catch up when the city came out of lockdown, and it's reminding voters of its long-promised expansion of the Canberra Hospital that hasn't been delivered yet. The Liberals have a grander plan to reduce wait times and recruit more medical staff. Like everything, it comes at a cost. It wasn't until late in the campaign Alastair Coe revealed the $1 billion price tag for his big promises, but not the economic modelling. His plan is to grow the pie, that is, grow the population and in turn revenue. Googong, just over the border, is the living example of what's wrong with Canberra, according to the Liberals. A thriving community with lower cost of living, paying taxes in New South Wales. That's why the Liberals are offering policies like the freeze on rates, a sore spot for Labor, which has overseen substantial rate rises this term to deliver tax reform, like the shift away from stamp duty to land tax. Labor's continuing its bold vision for climate change too. It has a big batteries plan, the Greens want Canberra gas-free sooner, and the Liberals' focus is 1 million more trees. For this growing city, light rail arrived. The first stage, Gungahlin to Civic's, been hailed a success and more track is to come, with all major parties now supportive of the extension to Woden. Of course, there are many Canberrans out of work. The ACT has fared better than most jurisdictions on the twin COVID crises of health and the economy, and the city is slowly coming out of the cover of restrictions. It's been a year like no other, capping off Andrew Barr's 6th as Chief Minister and Labor's 19th in office. So do voters want stability and experience in pandemic times, or are they more attracted to Alastair Coe's promise to bring down Canberra's cost of living? The biggest issue, the pandemic, is out of the control of both leaders.
And firmly in the hands of voters and those who calculate and count those votes tonight. Now, we're trying to bring you perspectives from as wide a footprint as we can around this compact little territory, and tonight we'll be talking regularly to ABC reporters on location. We have Dan Borscher at Labor Party headquarters in Belconnen. Tom Lowry has the Canberra Liberals function covered just on the outskirts of Civic, and Nada Gilmore at the always spirited Greens Party gathering. We'll chat to all three of them in just a moment. But we did want to cover off the fact, because keen observers will have noticed that ABC election coverage, wherever it's held, will normally start around 6 o'clock. Now, the reason why we've gone a little earlier tonight is because of the awesome capacity of computers at the Electoral Commission to deliver a result. Well, what this means is that we're running a little ahead of the party members. So with that in mind, we will check in at those venues, even though the crowds that you'll see there will be fairly sparse at first. So let's go to Dan Borscher at the Labor Club in Belconnen. And Dan, just picking up on that point, I'm not going to ask you the traditional question, what's the vibe there, because I'm going to assume there isn't much of one yet.
Yuma, good evening, Greg. No, I think that's fair to say that there's not much of a vibe here, given it's mostly media and party organisers preparing for the influx of members and candidates, in fact, and some of their family members who will be gathering here. But it certainly has been COVID-19 that keeps coming up in all the booths that I visited today. It's come up, it changed the way we vote. It also changed the way campaigning happened, and it's changed the way we gather to celebrate or commiserate, depending on the outcomes. Now, I was speaking to some Labor sources earlier, and they were saying they're cautiously optimistic, but certainly not wanting to go as far as saying that this is in the bag, adding that 23 years is a big ask, and you've touched on that tonight already, and it's something that kept coming up for those punters who were casting their vote today on this final day. Trust is the other thing that's been a big driver. And interestingly, I met a lifelong Labor voter today, Erica, and she said to me that for the first time in her life, today she decided to vote for Liberals because she feels like she's not being heard. She doesn't trust the government, and she told me that she feels she's been lied to. Now, what's particularly interesting about that, aside from that massive shift in the position that she's taken and the reasons why, is that she's in the seat of Murrumbidgee, that we've heard tonight is one of the places that's going to be watched very closely. So certainly one of the issues that's coming up, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that throughout the night, Greg.
Yeah, we will be coming back to you, Dan. But just to round off on this one, the timings, I suppose, where you are, no one knows how long it's going to take to get a result, but we have gone a little early with our broadcast. Is there a given time that traditional campaign partying begins then?
Oh, look, that answer is how long is a piece of string, depending on what time we get that first dump of votes in from the Electoral Commission, and of course, whether or not there's a call made or a call that needs to be made from here. So we're watching very closely. Some people are saying around the 7:30 mark. I'll have more for you, but we are likely in this time of COVID to be hearing some updates throughout the night here at the Belconnen Labor Club, because that's a part of protocols to make sure that everyone's informed about physical distancing and, of course, etiquette around touching and hand cleanliness and the like.
All
Greg,
right, well,
just so you're across the detail from here.
Yes, let's make sure we're not talking to you when that happens, Dan Borsche. We'll try and avoid that. Let's go to Tom Lowry. He's our eyes and ears with the Canberra Liberals throughout the night. And Tom, we've already heard from Vicky Dunn acknowledging the enormity of the challenge for the Liberals. From those you've spoken to, do they think they're up to this challenge?
Yeah, Greg, there's a real awareness of the mountain of a challenge ahead of them. I think Alistair Coe said about 12 months ago in a speech to the Press Club that to be a Liberal in Canberra, you have to believe in miracles. And I can assure you, you'll have a party room full of people believing in miracles tonight. Look, it will be a seated affair, so a bit more of a subdued affair here tonight, but there is a real sense of... You'll see there's a few sound checks going on behind me as well. It will be a bit of a different kind of experience tonight because of that seated affair, but there's still plenty of anticipation. The campaigns believe that they've left absolutely everything out on the paddock. They could not have worked harder over the past 6 weeks, and they've had to because 2020 has been a year of such enormous frustration for them because you've had those rolling disasters, the bushfires at the start of the year, the hailstorm that came after that, and the coronavirus pandemic, which really lifted the government's profile. You had people tuning in to Andrew Barr press conferences to find that if they could visit friends, visit their neighbours, go to restaurants and hotels and that kind of thing, and the opposition's had to capitalise on the little window it's had of this election campaign to get its ideas out there, to get its message across, see if it can convince those Labor voters to change their minds and give them a chance in government. So plenty of keen eyes in this room tonight to find out if they've done enough.
Yeah, so just one follow-up, Tom, because I know you've been actively reporting the campaign, and the Liberal strategy is very much built around cost of living. Is there any anecdotal evidence, you know, as you've been around the city today and in recent weeks, that is biting, that it has been an effective pinch point on the government?
It is something that does come up a lot in our reporting, that people are seeing their rates bills climb and climb and climb, and a lot of people don't feel the other side of the ledger, which is the reductions in stamp duties, the tax reform that Andrew Barr has spent so much time talking about. So that does bite. Whether it bites in the areas, or whether that issue cuts through across in the areas the Liberals need it to, is another question, because it is sort of perhaps Liberal voters that are feeling the pinch more than anybody else, as these things tend to sort of hit higher income earners in particular. They suffer more than anybody else. So it'll be interesting to see how that campaign works out. It has been an interesting Liberal campaign because it has been so narrow. They've only really talked about the cost of living, along with some other planning issues as well, I guess, but the cost of living above all else. Every press conference has started with, we want to make Canberra the best place to live, work and raise a family, and we want to lower taxes and better services. We want to put more money back into your pocket. So they've gone all in on a cost of living campaign in this election, and we'll see how it plays out for them.
We will. Tom Lowry, some people call that tight, some people call it disciplined campaigning. Let's see how it goes. We'll be talking to Tom Lowry at the Liberal function before too long. And rounding out our coverage from the respective events, the Greens are a fairly passionate lot, I think it can be said, in this city. Their function tonight will be in Turner, where Nada Gilmore joins us live. And Nada, there's a little more activity I can discern where you are than at the two majors, perhaps making up for the fact that although the Greens are running big candidate fields, their prospects for seats are pretty limited.
That's true, but you wouldn't know it, Greg. I think the Greens, out of all the parties, are ready to party tonight. This function was due to get underway at 6 p.m, but I think in this room that I'm standing in here at the Polish Club in O'Connor, we've actually reached capacity for COVID-safe restrictions. So it's filled up very quickly here today. People seem to be keen to catch up and talk about the campaign. And yeah, the room is almost full. So I think it will be a spirited celebration here tonight, definitely.
Yeah, and we spoke with Shane a little earlier. You probably heard it, Nada, that it's acknowledged how difficult Murrumbidgee might be. I suppose it's among the three brightest hopes for the Greens tonight. Anything you're picking up there about optimism, either there or in Ginninderra too, I suppose, is the other one.
That's right. Having spoken to the Greens camp, the upshot of what they've had to say to me is that they're cautiously optimistic. So obviously a great hope that Shane Rattenbury will hold on to his seat in Kurrajong. There's a big hope that Caroline Lakuta's support in the seat of Murrumbidgee will transfer to Emma Davidson, and they'll hold on to that second seat in the Assembly. And they're also hearing positive things about Joe Clay in Ginninderra and also Jonathan Davis in Brindabella. So cautiously optimistic going into this, but they have said that this campaign has been unlike no other that they've ever experienced due to the COVID era, if you like. It's been harder to get a real feel of the electorate and where people are sitting. Also the fact that there's been so many early votes, it's kind of hard to judge whether or not where the votes have fallen. So they're certainly pinning their hopes on something, and as I said, people are well and truly here tonight to hear how it's all going to play out.
Yep, well, we are all shooting a bit blind for the next 8 minutes at least, Nada, because that's when polls close. But thanks for your opening summary. Anyway, Nada Gilmore there at the Greens function at the Polish Club in Turner. Now, just a reminder that people can access results and analysis on ACT Votes 2020 in lots of ways tonight. We're broadcasting on ABC Radio Canberra, that's 666 on your AM radio, but also through the ABC Listen app. Then there's iView and streaming on Facebook Live too. And we're going to turn back to our panel now. And Rachel Stephen-Smith, I might start with you because we're all in this window before 6 o'clock talking about the power of the computer and the pioneering role, I suppose, that the Electoral Commission is playing here in the ACT. How does that change the way parties execute their campaigns?
Well, certainly I think we were really conscious that so many people would pre-poll that we really wanted to get our major policy announcements out before the beginning of that pre-poll period and really be very clear about what our messages were. And I think both Labor and the Liberals did that. As others have commented, the Liberal Party have been very disciplined about their messaging and their campaign.
But we were very clear. You've got to peak earlier, I guess.
Yeah,
is the point,
absolutely. And that's why we really focused on getting our health and education policies out prior to that pre-poll period starting, because we know that those are really key issues that voters are interested in, want to know what the party plans for the next 4 years.
Adam Shirley, before we go to Vicky Dunn for a first-hand perspective, we're talking about discipline and the really tightly targeted Liberal campaign. Is that the only card they really had to play, in your view, in trying to play catch-up politics against an incumbent government? Is it the strongest card in the deck?
It's interesting, Greg. I don't think it's the only card they had to play by any stretch. Alistair Coe's been leading for 4 years. He's had an opportunity prior to that as an MLA to get a sense for what his and other electorates are going through, what matters to them. but it's quite clear that they were narrow casting as far as their pitch to voters. Clear, straightforward phrases, which they hope, after 19 years of Labor incumbency, will offer enough of an alternative, and that, to a degree, without their hands on the Treasury coffers, that they will be taken on trust, on faith nearly, that they can deliver some of the big spending promises that they are offering. Counter to that, Labor has had a patchy record in some areas, such as transport and such as health. Apologies to Minister Stephen Smith, but health has been a challenging one at times for Labor. I don't think anyone's any doubt about that. So there is that element where I think the Liberal Party would have been counting on people disaffected with what they see as a lack of delivery, maybe a patchy record on those key areas. It would be so interesting to see if that was enough to pitch 2 or 3 seats towards the Liberal Party, as Vicky has acknowledged, is a big task in a region like the ACT.
Yep, so to you, Vicky, you didn't just stumble on this. You chose it for a reason as the platform for an entire campaign. Just briefly explain why you thought it was a winner.
I think it is a long burn issue, and what we've seen with the so-called tax reform of the Labor Party going back to 2012, where in the 2012 election we said, you know, if we go down this path, your rates will triple. Well, the rates revenue has tripled over that time. There has been, not individual ratepayers' rates have tripled, but the rates revenue has tripled. And there has been, you know, some tax reform, but the change in tax reform has been at the cost of homeowners and commercial business owners. And we've seen, because we talk to the electorate, Adam, that people are talking to us about how tough it is in Canberra. And I think that people don't appreciate that, you know, there is quite a broad spectrum of people in Canberra. There are high income earners and there are low income earners. The cost of housing, the cost of rental are higher in the ACT than anywhere else in the country. And we pay high taxes and we have, in many ways, quite low services, especially in the space, the health space. And, you know, Rachel and I have been crossing swords over health for 4 years now. And we are in a space where people really worry about going to the hospital.
All right, let's hold that thought. Briefly, Shane, because we do want to catch up with the reporter before or as polls close tonight, but it's almost an inversion if I was to summarise the Liberal strategy as the battler sort of campaign. It's almost an inversion that they're pitching themselves as the defenders of the battlers. I mean, does that strike you as challenging for the Greens, as aligned as you are with Labor?
Yeah, it's been an interesting position from the Liberal Party. They have been incredibly focused on that singular message. I think Alistair Coe's probably sick of hearing himself say it at this point in the cycle. But what we've also seen from the Liberal Party is they've walked away from a whole lot of issues they were prosecuting through the course of the last term. A number of policy areas they've simply either not spoken of or said, oh, look, that's not important to us anymore. And so I think one of the big question marks is if the Liberal Party are successful tonight, government is complex, there's many issues to address, and there's big question marks about where they stand on a lot of issues that are really important to Canberrans.
All right, well, we can ask some of those questions. You may as well as the night goes on, Shane Rattenbury. But time's drawing in towards the close of polls, by my reckoning, in about 3 minutes from now. So the doors will be locked at 6 o'clock sharp, local time, at more than 80 polling places. And that's when the last stragglers will have voted, ending that 3 weeks of what they're now calling a voting period, not just a polling day. So our reporter, Tom Maddox, is at one of the polling places, in fact at Aranda Primary, which is within the Ginninderra electorate. So Tom, what's the activity level been like at these polling stations, considering the very high rates of early voting this time around?
Pretty quiet, Greg. Look, you're going to have to get in pretty quick if you want to cast your vote now. We've got a couple of minutes to go and the rain's starting to come down. But as you say, the official's about to come out here with the phone, the clock on his phone and lock the door. But it's been a pretty smooth and steady day across all the voting booths. Here at Aranda Primary School in Ginninderra, about 1,000 ballot papers are due to be counted. So in a few minutes, that scrutiny process will start and that initial count of those ballot papers will begin before they hand over those paper ballots to the Electoral Commission for a formal count later tonight. But I have some numbers just in recent minutes. Just over 62,000 people cast their votes today. as of about 20 minutes ago, and that makes it to a total of 277,000, which is about a 91% turnout this year, Greg, which is slightly up on the 2016 turnout of 88%. So a bit of a tick there from the Electoral Commission.
All right, Tom Maddox, with the rain tumbling down upon you, we'll truncate this conversation and let you go and observe whatever happens at the tick of 6 o'clock there at Aranda Primary. We'll let Tom go because it is approaching 6 o'clock. In fact, let's get there precisely. It is 6 o'clock in Canberra right now. Just enough time before we start to focus in on any data feeds coming from the Electoral Commission to note that it's high season for elections in our region. That's all the way across the Pacific to the United States. So in between bringing you results on ACT votes tonight, we are trying to keep you up to date on what's happening across the Tasman in New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern and her Labor government are hot favourites to be re-elected, possibly in minority, against National leader Judith Collins in a poll that was slightly delayed by the pandemic. So our chief election analyst, Anthony Green, is going to sneak a peek at the counting in New Zealand. And Anthony, do we have any figures yet, or just a reflection on where they start from?
Depends how you report these things in New Zealand, because Australia with compulsory voting is one of the few countries that reports percentage of votes, all votes, because most countries, not everybody votes. But in New Zealand, I think this is about 17% of the reporting centres that are counted. I think it's about a third of what they do in New Zealand. They count all the advanced votes during the day and they report them after 7 o'clock local time. This is about a third of the advanced vote, and Labor is over 50%, which would give them 65 seats in the 120 seat chamber and a majority. Now, Winston Peters, New Zealand First, who was the Queenmaker at the last election, his vote has collapsed under 3% for New Zealand First, and they'll get no seats on those numbers. The Greens vote up slightly and they'll get 11, so they'll have a very substantial overall majority. But at the moment on these numbers, Labor will govern on their own. But I would warn, these are advanced votes. There can be a 2% shift. I seem to remember in the past the vote shifted to Labor after the advanced votes. I'm not sure what the trend has been at the last two elections. But ACT, who's a party to the right of National and have had only one seat for the last few elections, they've picked up a lot of the slack from the National Party and they've got 10 seats. But at this stage, Labor is doing well, and on these numbers, gets a majority on their own right. But there's a lot more counting to come. And also the other thing in New Zealand, the counting you get early is the smaller centres, the bigger centres come later. But at the moment, they're very good figures for the Labor Party.
All right, Anthony, thank you. We can, he's got a special button down there you might have noticed on his big screen, which will be dedicated to New Zealand updates. So we'll bring you more of those on ACT Votes 2020. You're watching ACT Votes 2020 live from the National Museum of Australia, where we'll be standing by now that polls have closed to look for the earliest counts and data available from the ACT Election Commission. And if you're not familiar with the system here, it's in the race for 25 seats in the Legislative Assembly on a proportional representation system, with Hare-Clark being the model for voting candidates in the ACT. So our Chief Election Analyst, Anthony Green, is standing by to give you a bit of an overview, a summary, if you like, of where the numbers are at the outset and what to look for tonight. Anthony?
Well, we'll look at the starting position. We expect that we could start getting results in the first half hour. The big whacks of electronic votes, they've promised us early. They said they'll get them all within the first hour or two. Is the latest press release. It was half an hour ago, a month ago. So I think they've just been scaling back expectations, but we still expect to get those early votes. Because of the way the Hare-Clark ballot paper works, it takes an hour before you get paper ballot counts, but we should get the electronic votes. The starting position tonight is that the Labor Party and the Greens govern in a coalition with a majority. The 25 seats, there are 11 Liberals, 12 Labor, and 2 Greens. Now, to explain the electoral system, for those who aren't familiar with it, there's 5 electorates in the ACT. Brindabella in the south has 3 Liberals and is where the Liberals traditionally get 3 seats. In the north, you've got Ginninderra around Belconnen and Werribee, which covers Gungahlin in the north. Labor holds 3 of the 5 seats in both of those. And across the central band, you've got Murrumbidgee on the west and south, and Kurrajong, which is the old part of Canberra. The Greens hold the balance of power seat in each of those. The way the electoral system works is basically in every seat, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party are basically guaranteed 2 seats each. Who forms government depends who wins the 5th seat in each district. At the current Assembly, it's Brindabella, the Liberals hold the 5th seat, Labor holds the 5th seat in Ginninderra and Yerrabee, and Kurrajong and Murrumbidgee, the Greens hold that 5th seat. Now, for the Liberals to win from here, they need to hold 3 seats in Brindabella. The next most likely seat for them to win is to take one off the Greens in Murrumbidgee. Then they'd be looking at either Ginninderra or Yerrabee. Now, we haven't seen much opinion polling data, so we haven't got a real sense of what that might all mean. But that's what we'll be looking for. If you hear us talking a lot tonight, we'll be looking at, can the Liberals hold 3 seats in Murrumbidgee? Will it be who will win the 5th seat in Murrumbidgee? Can the Liberals make a breakthrough in Ginninderra or Yerrabee, or the Belko Party in Ginninderra? I don't think anyone's expecting much big shift in Kurrajong. And the other thing to say about the Hare-Clark system is a sitting member can be defeated by somebody from the same party. That's something we always work for, and we also have 2 vacancies. Vicky Dunn and Karen Lacutia are both retiring in this election. So in each case, the party, if the party wants to hold its current position, it needs to elect someone to replace them. But anyway, hopefully we'll get some results soon.
Yes, and we'll let you, Anthony, go away and consult your computer to see if and when those first figures start to come through. And as Anthony's noting, it's the intra-party competition that is just as robust, really, as the inter-party competition. That's true across all 5 electorates. There is a lot of interest in one in particular, though. That is Murrumbidgee. And we're going to cross now to Labor MLA and Transport Minister Chris Steele, who's standing by at the Labor Club. Chris, yeah, there's going to be very intense competition in Murrumbidgee. You, I suppose, having the benefit of incumbency, must enter with a degree of optimism, but not only about your own seat. I'm interested in whether you think a third is even remotely possible for your party in Murrumbidgee.
Good evening, Greg and the panel. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank my constituents for their support and engagement over the past 4 years. It's been a real joy to represent them and the Labor Party in the Assembly in Murrumbidgee. At the last election, Labor only didn't have any incumbents at all. Now we have 2, so that's certainly something that we hope will boost our result in the electorate. And of course, the Liberal leader, that was Jeremy Hanson, is no longer, so we hope to see a benefit for Labor from that as well. We've also got a very large infrastructure program that we've brought forward at this election to protect and create jobs. Much of that is focused in Woden, with the extension of light rail into Woden, which will create over 6,000 jobs, which is certainly a positive running in our favour, as well as the new TAFE, our public TAFE, the CIT, which will build in Woden. So it's certainly been a very positive platform that we've put forward in this electorate, and we're hoping for a positive result tonight.
Chris Steele, be that as it may, your electorate, and you will have heard it from people in your electorate, is at the heart of some of the major transport headaches that have been at the doors, at the bus stops of Canberrans. I mean, how concerned are you that those transport problems will come home to roost tonight and actually bring a third Liberal candidate into the fold, and maybe as an MLA?
Not many people have been taking public transport over the last few months of the pandemic based on public health advice, but we actually saw more people using public transport overall, particularly in areas like Western Creek and Molonglo, because we put on more rapid services. And we saw that right across Canberra, particularly with the introduction of light rail. So there are some very positive signs there, and we've made some changes, listened to feedback, and I think that's what people respect. And we'll get on and deliver further improvements to the bus service as we go into the next term as well.
As you're aware, another key issue, which in a way sits in your electorate too, is health and the non-delivery of the mass expansion of the Canberra Hospital. There have been initial works, but the promise for the major works to be done has lapsed. Do you get the sense that some voters in Murrumbidgee are a bit sick of Labor and its incumbency, and that might push them towards the Liberals or even a minor candidate?
I think Canberrans trust Labor to deliver large infrastructure projects. We promised and delivered light rail stage 1, and they understand that these are large and complex infrastructure projects, and we'll get on with building the Canberra Hospital expansion and the expansion to the Centenary Women's and Children's Hospital. We've taken the time to consult with clinicians and with the community, and that has actually resulted in some quite substantial changes to the design of the hospital to alleviate parking and traffic issues, and I think people have responded really positive to that when I've been talking with them in the Curtin and Garran communities in particular.
The other issue is the redistribution into Murrumbidgee. A couple of inner south electorates have moved into your electorate and they traditionally favour Liberal candidates. Do you see that as being an issue, supporting the Liberal side of things?
Well, we've got 5 very distinct communities now in Murrumbidgee, the inner south at Western Creek, at Woden, Molonglo, and also half of Canberra in Tuggeranong as well, which is my home suburb. So there are very different issues in many of those suburbs. Certainly the demographics perhaps don't suit us in the inner south, but we are actually delivering light rail through this area, which will provide people with access to rapid transit for the very first time on 3 stops. So there are some very positive issues running in those suburbs as well, but certainly it will make it tougher for Labor in the seat of Murrumbidgee as a result.
All right, well, we might wrap up with Chris Steele there, just trying to be totally even-handed about these things and to make sure that we are across any moving numbers. Adam and I will both be speaking to Liberal MLA for Kurrajong, Elizabeth Lee, who's going to join us now. She's also opposition spokeswoman for education, disability and the environment. Now, Elizabeth, you're in Kurrajong, which I think it's broadly agreed is probably a lock on the configuration of the 5 seats that applied for the last 4 years. You can tell me if you think there's anything to be won or lost there tonight, but I'm more interested in looking further afield and wondering where you identify the pathway towards a co-government, whether in minority or majority.
Good evening, and thank you for that. I think that the Canberra Liberals never take a single vote for granted in any of the electorates. But I think there is no surprises, and no one will be surprised that, of course, you know, the focus in terms of getting that 3rd seat is going to be in Murrumbidgee and Werribee, and that's what we are looking at. The Canberra Liberals have put forward a very positive plan for Canberra to reduce the cost of living for Canberra families and to create a sustainable future for all. And I believe that the Canberra public have responded very positively to that message.
Elizabeth Lee, COVID's been such a big picture issue of consequence, of disaster for many countries. We felt the impact here in the ACT as well. In a political and election contest sense, has it been a hindrance somewhat to your side of politics trying to get your alternative message out?
There's no doubt that this year has been a challenging one for all Canberrans and, of course, all Australians and all around the world. And it is an interesting time to be running a campaign during COVID. Some of the election, I suppose, activities that we're used to, some of the face-to-face ones, were put on hold for a while, and especially being in opposition, that has made it difficult. But we know that health comes first, and we want to make sure that Canberra was safe, and that was always going to be the priority.
Looking at the issues that you think might swing it your way, as Greg was saying, beyond Kurrajong, do you think you made it stick enough with an explanation, not just an idea, on matters like rates, health and transport?
There is no doubt that Canberrans under 19 years of Labor have seen the skyrocketing rates that have really hit their back pocket. The Canberra Liberals put forward a really positive vision to make Canberra the best place to live, work and raise a family. We want to make sure that we back Canberra families, and I think that the Canberra public have been responding positively to our message. We've put forward really positive plans to improve our health, our education systems and also the environment, and I do think that the Canberra public have been really, really receptive to that message.
Yeah, and the public will well remember a couple of the rehearsed lines that were repeated ad nauseum, but the question, I suppose, Elizabeth Lee, is do you think voters got enough of an explanation on how to pay for those crucial promises and how that would work for the 4 years ahead?
I think that the Canberra public know that every single member of the Canberra Liberals has been out there knocking on doors and being at the shopping centres to talk directly to electors about our positive plan and to provide explanations for that. I think that every Canberran has seen the cost of living skyrocket here in Canberra and they are sick of it.
All right, well, Elizabeth Lee, we have a few more issues to pull apart here, so we're going to thank you and farewell you. Elizabeth Lee, Liberal candidate for Kurrajong. We may or may not be speaking to Elizabeth again as the night goes on, but we're trying to cover a bit of ground at this early stage of the evening, which is one of those are we there yet moments as we all, Rachel, Stephen Smith, peer into our computers and see if anything's showing up. It really emphasises to me with electronic voting that it's truly a matter of waiting now, because you don't even have scrutineers with eyes over the volumes of votes that went electronically. It's actually technically impossible to do, isn't it?
Yeah, my understanding is scrutineering is essentially you stand there and you watch someone press a button and, you know, did they press the button correctly? So it is hard to scrutineer on those electronic votes. But we will have scrutineers where the paper ballots are being counted, of course. So we're just waiting with bated breath like everybody else.
Yeah, so Vicky Dunn, that makes it a real mystery box, a locked box, which I'm going to assume you don't have any insights which way things go until pretty much the Commission hits that button.
No, but we in the ACT are very used to very high turnout for electronic voting, and you know, at the last election it was probably 30 to 40%, probably even a bit more. We understand that of the 70% of people who voted, about 80% of those voted electronically, so that they've got a big number of votes. And also the way that we voted electronically this time was a new system. It's a much improved system, and I think it was more user friendly, and I think that would have encouraged people to vote electronically. And you know, we certainly do lead the country with electronic voting.
So gone are those days of waiting. What did the olden days?
Well, when I was elected,
2 weeks
it was
or
2
something?
weeks. Yeah, it was 2 weeks to complete the scrutiny. There was electronic voting then. I think that was the second election with electronic voting. No, it was the first election with electronic voting. And since then, the proportion of people voting electronically has increased. And that means that when the Electoral Commission presses the button on that scrutiny, it's very accurate and increasingly accurate. And it will be very accurate tonight, I would suggest.
All right. Shane Rattenbury, just a quick one, because it was raised in Adam's interview with Elizabeth Lee. This is the issue of costings and growing the pie, magic pudding economics, some people call it. Is that a fair line of questioning, not by Adam, but by those who would criticise the inadequacy of Liberal costings? Is it fair in an environment where all bets are off, even for governments, when it comes to spending in this pandemic? The fiscal controls you would have operated under have gone too.
We're all Keynesians now.
No, look, it has been an extraordinary time, and from a budget point of view, having sat in the Cabinet for the recent months, there's no doubt that it has been a time where all the budget projections have blown out. This is clearly not a time for government to try and balance the budgets. It's not a time for austerity. It is a time for government to make strategic investments. For me, the question is making sure that those investments are ones that deliver a lasting benefit, not just stimulus for the sake of it.
And is that your criticism of Liberal policies, that they were just sugar hits? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I think my concern about the Liberal Party position has been that it's the classic, we've got to grow the population faster. And Alistair Coe has talked about if we have more population, we'll have more revenue. What he's not talked about is the fact that more population also requires more infrastructure. You have to build more schools, more hospitals, roads, transport infrastructure, all of these things, and there's been no discussion of that. It's really that classic population growth Ponzi scheme that we've seen him talking about.
All right, well, I did mention that are we there yet mentality. I can sort of answer it that we almost are, because Anthony Green, our chief election analyst, does have, I think, a small number of figures. Anthony, can we have a look at Brindabella?
Well, this is the first figures of Brindabella. Just to explain to people, there were 15 pre-poll voting centres, and all 15 centres take votes for the 5 districts. So there's 45 different reports that are going to come in for electronic polls, 5 from each polling place. This is 1.2%, so it's not from one of the 3 pre-poll centres in Brindabella. It's from somewhere else in the ACT, but they are Brindabella votes.
Probably.
What we're seeing at the moment is Labor Party's on 2 point, it's only 1.2%, but there isn't a lot of difference from area to area in the ACT. I will warn that. You don't have to worry too much about matched polling places in the ACT. Labor Party's on 2.37, the Liberals on 2.99, Greens are on 0.8. Too early to sort of call anything particular, except I'm pretty confident Labor's got 2 and the Liberals have got 2. That's not hard to draw conclusions in the ACT. If we look at the change in vote, on these numbers, the Labor vote's up, the Liberal vote's down, Greens up, others down. At the moment, this is early figures, so I don't think that's very reliable. But what I'll do is just show people what the graphics we look through the night. As well as looking at the party totals, we look at the individual candidates. So Mark Parton is an MP for the Liberals, Nicole Lauder, and there's another Liberal candidate at the moment, Andrew Wall, who's down the bottom there. This may depend where they're from in the electorate. Joy Birch and Mick Gentleman are the 2 sitting Labor MPs, and Tamus Werner-Gibbings is the 3rd place Labor candidate and one who's competing. The Greens down here, Jonathan Davis on 0.29. This is the trick with Hare Clark, is that on the party totals, the Greens have got 0.8. But when you look at the leaders' votes, their lead candidate is way down here on 0.29. And they need all that Green vote to stay within the ticket. Now, these are very early figures, won't make too many calls yet, but I'm pretty confident Labor and Liberal have got 2. But as I said, it's that 5th seat in each of the 5 districts, which is the one we watch for.
And you wouldn't, even with those caveats, Anthony, be suggesting that that's represents a softening of the Liberal vote, just
I wouldn't say that. I said this is 1.2 from a pre-poll centre somewhere else in the ACT. So it might be the people from Tuggeranong who work in Belconnen.
Yes.
And that's not a very representative sample of people who live in Tuggeranong.
Yeah, I think we might call this the Parkway batch of votes. That's all the people from Tuggeranong who drive up that blessed passage of road every morning because they have to work or be educated elsewhere away from home. Adam Shirley, I'm not sure how many people fall into that category, but I suppose it's convenient to vote somewhere else if you've got the opportunity to.
It certainly is, Greg. One interesting point to note about Brindabella, and it might add to the uncertainty around that 5th seat, traditionally an area where the Liberals do poll well and they get 3 members, but from the last election, there's 0.5 of a quota to deal out from the Australian Sex Party. Now, they're not running in this election. That is a significant number of votes that could be really pivotal in terms of who ends up retaining or taking that 5th seat. So Brindabella's a bit of a sleeper in some ways, worth watching and keeping on to see where that nearly 3,700 votes will land. If we hear, and it is true to say, this is just a matter of 1,000 votes over the entire electorate, that's going to be pretty important in the scheme of things, I would say.
Right. Well, here's a conversation I didn't think we were going to have, Rachel. When Sex Party voters have nowhere else to go, where do they end up?
Well, I mean, no one knows really where they end up. And we've also seen, I think, a change in Brindabella in a couple of other areas. We've had a very strong policy commitment around Brindabella for Labor. We've got 2 strong incumbent candidates in Joy Birch and Mick Gentleman, and there have been some not very nice things said about Joy and Mick over the last couple of weeks, but they're both members who actually really strongly represent their constituents. And then Tamus Werner-Gibbings has obviously campaigned really hard as well. So we've had people out there on the ground. And of course, people in Brindabella really experienced firsthand the threat of bushfire in January this year, and they've really seen the Labor government step up with that experience, and Mick Gentleman as the Minister for Emergency Services. So I think there's a bunch of things that are going to be at play in Brindabella.
If that were true, Vicky Dunn, that a crisis, in this case in the form of bushfires lapping into the valley, if that were advantageous to Labor, as Rachel suggested it might be, why would it not be for incumbent MLAs, all 3 of them, that you have in Brindabella?
Oh, I think that these figures are probably not worth worrying about. I actually think that Rachel is right, that although people have been critical of Mick and Joy, there is no doubt about the fact that they are strong local members and that will show up tonight. I've done this 6 times. Hare Clark is a really tough master, and you do, to some extent, eat your own. To some extent, when I got elected by 54 votes against another Liberal colleague, and it's a pretty hard thing to do. And there is, if you're ambitious, you're going to be going after a sitting member's seat.
Yeah, so that's the eat your own phenomenon, but looking at the fact that this is a high watermark seat for Liberals, having 3, you wouldn't want to see that trend in votes continue
Oh, no,
simply because if they did, you'd be back down to 2.
Well, yeah, if that 1.2%
Yes.
translated across the board, the election would be over, but I don't think that that's the case. I think that Andrew Wall and Mark Parton and Nicole Lauder are, again, very hard-working local members, and I don't really expect to see Brindabella have a change of local members.
Shane, any dissenting view on that? Do you think Brindabella is shaky? I mean, we're talking about Currajong and a couple of other seats pretty much being a lock. What do you think of Brindabella?
Brindabella is an interesting electorate. That 8% Sex Party vote last time is, I think, the real wild card in this one. Certainly our candidate, Jonathan Davis, has been out there working incredibly hard. He's a big personality and he's made a real impression in the electorate. I've spoken to some of the other candidates from the other parties who've sort of marked how strongly he's campaigned out there. And as Vicky touched on, Hare Clark is very much about the individuals. And so sometimes an individual can make a real impression and perhaps defy a broader party trend to really get themselves well known, recognised, and potentially winning a lot more votes than a historical party trend might suggest.
Yeah, I think Tamus Werner Gibbings is not no newbie in this either. He has a few campaigns under his belt. Now, we've been talking to Vicky Dunn, who is an outgoing MLA retiring. There is
Outgoing is better than retiring.
Okay, retiring, whatever. There is another who's heading for the exit tonight, and that's Carolyn Lakuta, who's with the Greens in Murrumbidgee. She's also tonight at the party function in the suburb of Turner. So, Caroline, welcome. You won't be leaving without having done a little heavy lifting for your party in Murrumbidgee. What's your assessment tonight as you head out the door of the chances of retaining? Because your name is a brand name and that's gone now.
Look, first off, I want to just thank the people of Murrumbidgee for their support for me, and even more than that, for the support for the Greens. I think Emma Davidson, our candidate, has an excellent chance of retraining the seat. As I say to people, what's happening in Murrumbidgee is generational change. I'm getting a bit old and tired and, dare I say, cynical. Emma's the age of my daughter. She's a Murrumbidgee resident. She's been a campaigner for many, many years, and I think she'll be a great representative for Murrumbidgee, and I'm pretty hopeful that she will be elected.
Carolyn Lakuta, we're getting some significant numbers coming through that Anthony will explain to us very soon, but on your anecdotal evidence, how strong is support for the Greens in your electorate, given that you are retiring?
Look, it was really different for me campaigning this time compared to 2016. 2016, people seemed really, really angry with the government, and I expected it to change. This time, people felt, wow, we are so lucky to be in the ACT from a COVID point of view, and there just didn't seem like an appetite for change. And I must admit, the people I spoke to, a lot of them talked to me about what my retirement plans were. So the vibe I got from the electorate of Murrumbidgee would be that things are likely to stay exactly as they are from a representational point of view there.
Should things turn a little further in your direction, will you regret retiring at this point when you could have potentially had more influence into the next 4 years of government?
Oh, well, yes. It's always really hard to choose when to leave. And yes, I have felt it'll be bittersweet if we get a really good result. I'll be so frustrated that I wasn't there with more Greens, but also really pleased that I've been part of making sure there will be more Greens this time, if that is the case, or at least making sure that we keep the Greens representation, which is really, really important.
2 terms, 2 separate terms in your political career in the ACT, Carolyn Lakuta. Thank you for your time tonight. Congratulations on it.
Okay, well, it's kind of timely that Carolyn Lakuta joins us at this point because, as Adam was speaking to her, this large whack of votes that we've been anticipating has started to arrive. Anthony Green, Chief Election Analyst, let's go to that seat we were just discussing with Carolyn Lakuta. It's Murrumbidgee.
We've got 26% of the vote counted, so this is quite a lot of the pre-poll votes from within the district. The Labor Party's got 2, and just to explain for people who aren't used to the Hare Clark system, this is the percentage vote, but we talk about it in quotas. There are 5 seats per electorate you need 16% of the vote. So a party with 37 has got 2 and a bit quoted. So the Labor Party has enough for 2 seats. The Liberals have 2. The Greens have 0.7. There's an independent with 0.5 here, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But it's interesting to look at who's here, who's getting elected. Chris Steele has got a quota, and we reckon he's elected on those numbers. Jeremy Hanson on the Liberal ticket, his vote is well down on last time, but he's not the party leader this time, and you expect a bit of a drop-off in his vote. So, but Jeremy Hanson will be elected on those. The third place candidate is an independent, Fiona Carrick, who's involved, I think it's the Western Creek or Molonga
Community
Woden
yeah,
Community
it's on the
Council.
community council there. So she's clearly from the ungrouped column has run a very effective campaign on these numbers. Now, whether this carries through to the rest of the election or not, none of the matter. And then Marisa Patterson is the second place Labor ticket, who's an academic at ANU. She's ahead of Beck Cody, who's the third place Labor candidate at the moment. Julia Jones is down here on 0.38, and the other 2 candidates, Emmadeep Singh and Ed Cox, are on 0.3. Those 3 candidates are basically getting the linear vote. People have voted at the top of the ticket and gone down, where Jeremy Hanson's the only one with a significant personal vote by the look of that. So at the moment, that's 2 Labor, 2 Liberal. Chris Steele and Jeremy Hanson, Labor and Liberal, are elected. It's hard to see who the second Labor candidate is. It's hard to see who the second Liberal candidate is. But you'd always favour the sitting members as the vote comes in. Fiona Carrick's problem is she's got 0.49. She's sitting there third on the totals. But when you look at the overall total for the group, the Greens have got a higher first preference. So I think the problem that she'll have is she'll get up maybe half a quota, but she won't get preferences to get up. She won't get ahead of the Greens. But we'll have to wait and see. But that's quite a remarkable first result. It's hard to know whether that's to do with electronic voting or whether you'll get a different result on the day.
Starting to look a little like status quo in Murrumbidgee. We'll get some thoughts from our panel in a moment, but we have figures in from other seats too. So let's go back to Anthony now to take a look at Brindabella, about which we've also been previewing and discussing with the panel. Anthony?
This is the beauty of electronic voting. We've now got 46% of the vote counted. The Labor Party's ahead there. Now, this is the seat where the Liberals had 3 last time, 2.47 to 2.32. Now, I'll just say this, traditionally, the Labor Party does slightly worse with electronic voting than on-the-day voting. That's all turned upside down at this election because 60% of the vote is electronic. Is it going to be representative or not? So we're not sure. We'll find out later in the night. But at the moment, the Labor Party is ahead on 2.47, the Liberals 2.32 and the Greens on 0.65. Now, remember that figure, 0.65, is the total for the Greens. Because when I look at the leaders, you'll see that there's 5 candidates there for the major parties who have got the Green total or more. And the difficulty for the Greens is trying to turn their 0.65 into a quota if there are candidates on the other tickets. For instance, the Greens can't pass Mark Parton or Nicole Lauder, and they won't pass Troy Birch. Mick Gentleman is the 4th place candidate at the moment. So you'd say there's a good chance that those 4 sitting members will be re-elected. It then comes down to whether it's Tamus Werner-Gibbings, Andrew Wall or Jonathan Davis for the last seat. And on this count, there's no way to determine that. But we get a preference distribution a bit later today, and we'll get a better handle on that. But at the moment, that's 2, 2 and 1 seat in doubt. But the Labor is doing much better in Brindabella on these numbers than the Liberal Party did last time.
All right. Anthony, we will let you go away and see, and he'll come back to us quickly, Anthony, if those numbers are powering ahead, as we see there in Brindabella, already approaching 46%. So a bit to digest there with our panel. Adam Shirley, let's go over to you. You don't want to start talking about trends at 1.2%, but at 46, there's something going on there for Labor in
Brindabella it is. And I said it earlier, it could be a bit of a sleeper. It's unfolding that way, still unclear exactly how. But I think noting that Andrew Wall, who's a sitting MLA and has had prominent shadow positions, is struggling at this point. Granted, there's still over 50% of the vote to come, but that is a challenging result at this point for a traditional Liberal stronghold, and where they would be quietly confident of holding three seats within the Assembly. I'm interested to get your take on that, Vicky Dunn. Did you anticipate Andrew Wall in particular, with that name recognition, with that prominence in some portfolios, that he would be in the position he's in now?
I'm very surprised at those figures. I mean, our 3 guys collectively have very high name recognition and they've worked hard in the electorate. I mean, Mark Parton has his own name recognition because of his previous career. but I'm quite surprised at those figures. And also at 46% of the vote, to look at those figures, that doesn't look great. It is. I mean, it's not the sort of figures that we would be expecting to see in Brindabella.
Well, that's telling. That's quite a frank observation, Vicky. From Vicky, sorry, Rachel. Do you concur?
Yeah, look, I think, this is a great result for us at this point in time with this much of the vote counted. And I think it's also interesting to note that this comes off the back of 2016 where there was a swing against the Liberals in Brindabella. So it's not like they got a huge swing to them in 2016 and now it's swinging back again. They actually got a swing against them in 2016 and now it looks like it's swinging against them
was our high
further. So this is definitely one to watch now.
And this is because, in part, I'll get your thoughts in a moment, Shane Rattenbury, but this is not a seat where there's a rock star performer for any party that fills out 1.5 quotas and drags, another person effectively over the line with them. It's scrounged for each and every single vote, and you're seeing some change in the orders there too.
Yeah, and look, I think Vicky talked earlier about getting out and talking to voters. ACT Labor, right across the board, has had 600 volunteers make 235,000 phone calls, and we've knocked on 65,000 doors over the course of this year. And obviously we couldn't start door knocking until mid-August again after stopping in February, March. So we've really been out there in every single electorate talking directly to voters about what matters to them, and that ground game makes a huge difference.
Well, there's something going on there. And Shane Rattenbury, we haven't yet covered off Murrumbidgee. Let's start with Brindabella, then we'll go to Murrumbidgee, or we can bracket them together. Are you feeling like there are 2 Green seats here for you, for the taking?
It's certainly a positive start on those numbers. The Greens have held Brindabella before, and it's often said that Tuggeranong won't elect Greens, that somehow our message doesn't resonate in Tuggeranong, but I think that we have held the seat before and people underestimate the support for us down there. We have seen now Jonathan is starting to come up the tally. I'm surprised by the return for Andrew Wall. In that Liberal tally, I think Andrew is a hard-working member. I work with him a lot on some of the committees in the Assembly, and I wouldn't have expected that differentiation between the Liberal candidates and the electorate with the loss of some vote there to see it spread out so clearly amongst the candidates.
It's worth noting there as well that Andrew Wall in the last election got the highest number of votes for any Liberal candidate in Brindabella. He got 0.7 of a quota in the end, so it is, well, obviously quite a stark result to be trailing in the way he is currently. There's still 50% plus to come, but going to Vicky's point, it is unusual to see it in this way.
Yep.
Well, you're giving us those acknowledgements, Vicky, and then Shane. Can you proffer some reasons?
No, I can't at this stage. I mean, I've looked at what my colleagues are doing, and I know that in different ways, Andrew and Mark and Nicole have had very strong ground game campaigns.
I'm thinking about issues. I'm just wondering, moving aside from the activity of an individual and their campaigning techniques, the door knocking, the shoe leather, I'm just wondering if you can think of a geographical reason.
I think that overall for this election, COVID has been the potent thing, and we're seeing it in New Zealand with a strong vote for the incumbent party. We were always behind the 8 ball, because I think, as you said earlier in the piece, Greg, everyone was out every day listening to the Chief Minister and the Health Minister side by side with the Chief Health Officer talking about COVID for months and months and months. And it's very hard for non-government people to be in that space. And we were not going to be going out and criticising the government to get some air. And that has been very difficult for us. And so that the ground game, the phone banking and that sort of thing has been very important for us, and we don't underestimate that at all.
Reasonable analysis, and I thank you for your honesty. Back to Shane Rattenbury for some thoughts on issues and policies that might be at play in Brindabella. But you're watching ACT Votes 2020 live from the National Museum of Australia, where we're tracking tonight just not only the results of the ACT, but also another election happening across the Tasman in New Zealand, where the Ardern government is seeking re-election. And our chief election analyst, Anthony Green, has an update in numbers there. So, Anthony, let's go back to you. for a tally from the Shaky Isles.
Well, there's 3.5 million voters in New Zealand. They've counted 1.3 million votes, and they're all advance votes. They're not on-the-day votes. And at this stage, the Labor Party is consistently above 50%, which at the moment would give them 66 seats and majority. You need 61 for majority. And it should be pointed out, since MMP was introduced in 1996, no single party has won a majority government in its own right. John Key got very close once or twice for national, but no party's ever done it. So at the moment, Jacinda Ardern, a lot more for county to come, but is very well positioned to get majority in her own right. The Greens are there as well with 8.2% and 11 seats. National 25.7 and 33 seats, a very poor result for them. And they've lost seats, vote to right and left, with the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers on 7.6% and 10 seats. Winston Peters, that great veteran of New Zealand politics who goes all the way back to Rob Muldoon in the 1970s when he was a protege of Muldoon. 2.3% no seats. They fall under the 5% barrier. So having made Jacinda Ardern Prime Minister at the last election, when he, Labor won fewer seats, he chose to put Jacinda Ardern into government. He has been the big loser at this election and loses out. But at this stage, Labor is still on track for majority government in their own right. It's a big win for the Labor Party.
In pride of place at the National Museum of Australia, an important piece of cultural history. This is the outside broadcast van used by the ABC in 1956 to bring an eager nation live coverage of the Melbourne Olympic Games and the exploits of Betty Cuthbert, Dawn Fraser and Murray Rose. They were all covered in part by this Morris FE model van that was spectacularly fitted out with 3 cameras inside it. Well, we're operating with a slightly higher degree of technological sophistication, bringing you ACT Votes 2020 from the National Museum of Australia tonight, where vote tallies are building up quite quickly as predicted. We've had numbers in for Murrumbidgee and Brindabella, and we are midway through a discussion with our panel, including the ABC's Adam Shirley, Labor's Rachel Stephen-Smith, Vicky Dunn from the Liberal Party and Shane Rattenbury from the ACT Greens. We're starting to pull apart a trend that's emerging in the Tuggeranong district. This is the Brindabella electorate, and Shane Rattenbury, just because we didn't have a chance to get some thoughts from you earlier, you and Vicky Dunn are of a piece that something is going on there. Vicky says it's pandemic politics. Incumbent governments are hard to knock the paint off in the sort of year we've had in 2020. Agree that would be a phenomenon at play in Brindabella?
I think there's no doubt that the pandemic changed the ACT election this year. I think it mitigated against the its time factor that was facing the ALP and to some extent by association the Greens. And the other interesting one I'm looking at, and it's coming through in the New Zealand result as well, is the challenge for smaller parties who are part of multi-party governments. The historical trend that we've seen right across the world is that the small parties tend to struggle in a subsequent election. We're seeing that, I think, with New Zealand first a little bit, although the Greens are holding their vote up. But you tend to see this trend where the smaller party, if the government goes well, the big party gets the credit. And if things go wrong, the smaller party tends to get punished. That's where I'm particularly pleased to see the New Zealand Greens holding up. We spent some time in New Zealand last year talking with them because they're in a similar situation to us, being cabinet ministers in a larger government. And so we're looking very closely at their results tonight and certainly have our fingers crossed for our Kiwi counterparts.
Incumbency in a disaster is one thing, Shane Rattenbury, but there is still that element, particularly strong in people that will rung into the radio station that I work on. Many times I've spoken with members across different parties. The incumbency of Labor was keenly felt, and there was that big "it's time" question mark at the very least. Why is it in Brindabella, for instance, we're seeing a firmer result for the incumbents when some people might expect it to go the other way and the Liberals push for at least 3 seats and maybe a couple more in a couple of other electorates?
That could go very specifically to the bushfire response earlier in the year, Adam, where the southern part of Canberra, for those watching from around the country, it was that southern seat of Brindabella that was in the direct firing line, potentially, of that very significant blaze right through the national park. People were very frightened. They were thinking back to 2003, where Canberra was so heavily impacted by the fire. And I think there was a great response from our emergency services and maybe particularly with Mick Gentleman as the Emergency Services Minister, we are seeing that play out for the Labor Party in that part of the city.
Well, let's get some perspective on the ground now from a Liberal MLA in Mark Parton. He's going to be joining us as a Brindabella MLA in just a moment. But before we go, let's go via Anthony Green, first of all, just to revisit the numbers, and we might even see how Mark Parton's travelling. Anthony?
Well, there were the numbers we looked at a moment ago. The Labor Party on 2.47 quotas, Liberals 2.32, the Greens 0.65. When we look at the candidates that are leading, Joy Birch and Mark Parton, Nicole Lauder and Mick Gentleman are all ahead of the total of the Greens. So they are very strongly, highly likely to be elected. Tamus Werner-Gibbings and Andrew Wall from the Labor Party and the Liberal Party respectively are in a race with Jonathan Davis for the Greens for the final spot. So it's definitely to each, and Mark Parton himself as the leading person on that ticket. He and Nicole Lauder should be re-elected. The question at the moment is Andrew Wall is behind their numbers. And at this stage, we've got a lot more counting to come yet in that seat.
Anthony, thank you. Well, let's go to the man himself, Mark Parton, Liberal MLA for Brindabella, also opposition spokesman for planning, housing, gaming, racing and assistant speaker. Yes, you do get a few portfolios thrown at you in the ACT ministries. Mark Parton, you finished in number 4 slot in Brindabella overall last time. Current indications you've leapt up the ladder a few rungs, or at least, you know, 1 or 2. What's been the secret to your personal success before we get to questions about the party?
Well, I guess, Greg, I'd start by saying thank you to everyone in Brindabella that's voted for me, because it's been, you know, a wonderful pleasure for me to serve the electorate for my first term for 4 years, and I certainly didn't count on being re-elected this time round, and I'm overwhelmed by the support that's come from the people of Tuggeranong. I don't know, I can't really explain, you know, it's difficult for me to explain why those people have voted for me. I'm just pleased that they have. I believe that I'm a genuine grassroots local member. I do a hell of a lot of door knocking, and look, the pandemic has made it really tough for us to connect, you know, and what I sense we're seeing here tonight is the effects of having an election campaign when you can't really have an election campaign. And I know that there's a lot of water still to pass under this bridge, and there's a lot of votes to be counted, but I would be lying if I said to you that we were happy and pleased with where we're sitting at the moment. You know, it is a little disappointing. There's still a lot of votes to be counted, and you know, we live in hope. But you know, that was a long answer to a very short question, Greg. I'm sorry.
We're going to look at your electorate a bit before we go a little broader, Mark Parton. Within the chamber, your side of politics was highly critical at times of Minister Mick Gentleman on emergency services, on policing, and yet he is polling relatively well above your own Andrew Wall, who did the best in Brindabella for the Liberals last election. Why is that?
Look, I don't know, and I guess we'll drill down and have a look at these things, you know, in the aftermath. I would say that points that have been made by this panel in the last few minutes, I think, are extremely pertinent. That we've had not one crisis, but 2 crises that we've faced in the ACT, and certainly the electorate of Brindabella was very much threatened by the bushfires. I mean, we could see them from all over the electorate, and there were times when it appeared that we'd have fire racing into the suburbs. And Mick is the Emergency Services Minister, and so he played a major frontline role day after day after day, informing people that's what governments do. Now, unfortunately, oppositions can't play that role, and so we're caught not even between a rock and a hard place, we're out the back somewhere, because we can't really be, you know, certainly in times of an emergency, you don't want to be critical of what the government is doing, and that applies even more so when we got to the pandemic. Now, I know that those in Labor and the Greens will say that we have been critical of the government, and we have on a few occasions, but by and large, we've just been in step with what they've done, because that's what you would expect an elected member to do. And so I think what we're seeing here is the results of an election campaign when you couldn't really have an election campaign.
You say that you've been in step with the government in the crisis response, but Alistair Coe, your leader, at times has been critical of Labor and its response in COVID, particularly with restrictions. Was that an error or even a mistake, not even before the campaign, but from May, June and then into the campaign?
No, I don't think it was a mistake. I think that what Alistair was doing was speaking on behalf of businesses and residents, particularly when we consider that at certain times during this pandemic response, New South Wales restrictions were eased much more quickly than ours. It's our job to stick up for people who are being left behind. And so that's what we were doing when we did make a bold decision to step out of that government line and say, well, hang on a second, this is not really working, and to put pressure on that to change. Now, ultimately, that hasn't paid off, but, you know, I guess, you know, again, we've got a lot of votes to count, and I certainly wouldn't rule out any result at this stage.
There'll be broader discussions about both major parties and the Greens' campaign strategy. But given your former career was on making quite a song and a dance in radio, and successfully too, how critical or supportive have you been of the broader campaign that the Liberals have run, with the catchy slogans, a few of the stunts, but at times not the background or even the substance to explain them?
Look, I think one of the things that's typified the Liberals in this term is a unification. I know there was apparently a bushfire that media spoke of late last year, but I didn't see much of that. So we have been a unified team. We've been a disciplined team. And certainly, you know, even at this stage, I'm not prepared to be critical of that campaign. I think that enormous discipline was shown by all throughout. And you know, as a campaign team, they grabbed onto the issues that they believed would get us over the line in terms of cost of living pressures and some of the other government's failures, and we continued to push in those spaces. You know, time will tell if we get to the end of the night and that hasn't worked, but you know, we can pick that apart as we get more details in terms of these votes being counted.
Was it a campaign style you would have run, Mark Parton?
Matey, I was not in charge of the campaign.
But that wasn't my question, though.
So, look, it probably isn't the campaign style that I would have run, but you've got to understand that it's horses for courses, and I'm extremely pleased with the campaign that was run, and I think it was tailored around Alistair's skills, and I think, you know, I'm extremely happy with the campaign as it was run.
You're leading the Liberal charge in your seat in Brindabella, Mark Parton. We thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's 6:51 in the nation's capital. That means polling places, polling booths closed fully 51 minutes ago, which puts us firmly in that window now of large volumes of votes starting to be crunched by the computer system run by Elections ACT. So to see exactly where we're up to at this point in the evening, let's go to Anthony Green standing by his screen. Anthony, for a bit of an overview first of all.
An overview first of all, let's do this. Most of these votes are from Brindabella and Murrumbidgee from the south. So if we look at the overall vote, we're seeing Labor's on 39.7, Liberals 36.2, Greens 11.5, others 12.6. If we look at the change in votes since last time, the Labor vote's up slightly, the Green vote's up slightly, Liberal vote down slightly, others down slightly. So there's not a lot, but as I said, this is very much concentrated. This is basically comparing half the votes in Brindabella and Murrumbidgee to the Territory from last time. We haven't corrected this from where the vote's from. So at the moment, that's what we're looking at. We're starting to fill in the chamber with seats we're pretty sure are definitely won, which is, it's not that hard to do in a Hare-Clark electoral system, but at the moment we're confident that Labor's on 8, the Liberals have got 6 and there's 1 Green. So we've given away 15 seats and we're just working towards sort of filling in those gaps with a couple of other seats.
Yes, I think the starting position is pretty much 10-all to begin with, and then we spend the night discussing the remaining 5. But we have concentrated on Murrumbidgee and Brindabella so far, and noting, Anthony, that we don't seem to have a lot in from Ginninderra just yet. Can we take a bit of a dive into what we do have for Ginninderra?
Let's have a look. You never know when these are suddenly going to update. We've got 2.3% counted. The Labor Party's on 2.3, the Canberra Liberals on 1.3, Greens 0.9, the Belco Party 4.7. I think it was interesting. I always thought one of the issues would be whether the Belco Party took votes from the Liberals. At the moment, it's a very early count, but that's the thing to watch for in this electorate. If we look at the leaders, and of course Vicky Dunn's retiring from this electorate, Yvette Berry's certain of election, Tara Shane's very strongly polling, Elizabeth Kickett, a sitting member, Gordon Ramsay, a sitting member. So the 4 sitting members are sitting top of the list there. Then there's 2 Greens. Actually, the fact that there's 2 Greens with the same vote says there's actually no personal vote on that ticket. That's people voting straight down the Green ticket. And then you're getting onto the other Liberals. Chick Henry is out polling Bill Stefaniak, which is a bit of a blow for Bill, I think, because Bill's got more than 15% 3 times, so that doesn't look good. But this is a very small count, it's anonymous. You don't know. I think if this is an electronic vote, I think it's from Kippax. I'm not sure where Kippax is, but I'm not sure
West
it's
Belconnen.
Yep.
It's in Belconnen.
West Belconnen.
West Belconnen. Well, that's where those votes are from anyway. So that's an interesting first set of figures there for that electorate.
Okay, and then that leaves 2 other seats unaddressed. I think Yerrabee might be a bit beyond us at the moment. So shall we take a dip into Kurrajong, which is your inner north, and these days a little of the other side of the lake as well. Anthony, what have we got for Kurrajong?
Well, this has gone to 27%. That was a huge jump then. The Labor Party's on 2.39 quotas. The Greens on 1.63. The Liberals are only 1.29. It's a very poor result at the moment. Now, these are all electronic votes. Is there a difference between on the days and electronics? But at the moment, that's a very strong result for the Greens and a very poor result for the Liberals. But I suspect this may reflect the type of vote. But let's have a look at who's leading. And Andrew Barr's got 1.4 quotas, easily elected. Shane Rattenbury's got 0.9, will be elected. Elizabeth Lee's got half a quota and will be elected. The fact that Rebecca Vassarotti's on 0.45, so I mean she's actually 4th at the moment and she's 2nd on the Green ticket. And in fact, it's very significant if the second Green is doing well on the votes, then Shane Rattenbury's not going to get elected on the first preferences. It'll be interesting to see how many votes leak into the ticket with 2 candidates there. Rachel Stephen-Smith, now on roughly the same votes as the others, but I would point out Andrew Barr's got 1.4 quotas in his own right. The tendency when a leader is their tickets, their preferences tend to flow to the other sitting members. So while Rachel Stephen-Smith there is on 0.33, I think she's a bit more secure than just a third of a quota.
I'm glad you think so.
So I would expect Andrew Barr's preferences will flow that way.
I'm more confident than you.
But certainly, if you go back to the party totals, you would say with Kurrajong 2-2-1 normally. At the moment, it's definitely 2 Labor. 1.6, if that stays that way for the Greens, that's a real worry for the Liberal Party. And the Canberra Liberals are running 1.39. They will not get 2 seats from 1.29. So that's the seat we'll be coming back to through the evening.
Well, can I suggest, sorry, Vicky Dunn, that would represent, I'll come to you in a moment, Vicky, that would represent a major upset because I think as a panel we started out in broad agreement that Kurrajong was a lock, that it'd be 2-2 and Mr Rattenbury over here. Let's go to our 2 resident experts on Kurrajong. Rachel, are you prepared to contemplate the possibility of a Liberal loss there on those numbers?
Well, we've been campaigning really hard, and I know the Greens have as well. We've had really, really hard-working campaigns on the ground. Maddie Northam and Jacob Ingram have worked incredibly hard, and Judy Anderson, who was only named as one of our candidates relatively late, has also worked incredibly hard since she was named. And I've had people out there making calls. I've been knocking on doors myself. And I think the other point I wanted to make that I think is relevant right across the board is, yes, we've had a lot of airtime through COVID and for Andrew through the bushfires, but I think that's not just been about getting faces on television. I think it's also been about people getting to know Andrew Barr and realising that actually he's incredibly competent. He is a lot more likeable than I think people probably thought he was in 2016. As he's talked more and as people have been able to hear more about who he is and what he stands for and the way that he governs, people have increased their level of confidence in Andrew Barr as a leader.
And that's reflected in his own 1 point...
He has increased his own vote as well, that's right.
Yep. Shane Rattenbury, can I ask you the same question as Rachel? You're back, congratulations, but the second Liberal seat looks a little shaky, would you suggest?
Look, it's a deliberate strategy. We've targeted this seat in this election for exactly this reason and heavily promoted our second candidate quite deliberately. In some ways, sought to cannibalise a little bit of my vote to try and make sure Rebecca is further up the pile as that cut-up process starts. We go back to the federal election where my colleague Tim Hollow ran and came very close to outpolling the Liberals during the federal election. It is a strong area for the Greens. It is often described as Green Heartland, this part of the city. It's where we get our best voters, the numbers are showing. But we have had a deliberate targeting of this seat to try and get the outcome that we're seeing on these early numbers. Now, as we've all talked about, there is distance to go, but this is reflecting what we have sought to do in this seat.
The other point I'd make about the Greens and Rebecca Vasrotti's relatively good showing to this point is she's someone who has got some name recognition. We've talked about how that's a really important part of an ACT election. Vicky will attest to that, given her long career and her name recognition in Ginninderra. Rebecca Vasrotti has served leading a variety of not-for-profit and community organisations. She's already had a crack at a couple of elections, so she will be a name that at least is somewhat familiar to wavering Kurrajong voters, wavering whichever way they might go. So perhaps there might be an inkling of let's give her a go. We kind of know who she is. Let's see what else she's got.
All right, Adam, thank you. Vicky, we did cut you off
No,
just to
that's
go
all right.
to the Kurrajong candidates first of all.
One of the things I was thinking about is that there is a high electronic vote, but I'm actually wondering whether that cuts off demographically, that older voters are less inclined to vote. And if that is the case, I don't know. If older voters are voting paper votes, then you might see a surge in the Liberal vote later in the piece. And also that I know that the Electoral Commission handed out low 20,000 postal votes. They expect to get about 7,000 or 8,000 of those. There would be a big uptick. And again, postal votes do push strongly for the Liberal Party across the board.
Yeah, but electronic penetration was so high.
Yes, yeah.
It'd be a forlorn hope, wouldn't it? Hanging out for those last envelopes of postals to come back.
Well, actually, it's a combination of the sorts of people who would vote postal votes. And when I was out campaigning with my guys, there were people who said, I've got a postal vote, and they were invariably elderly, people who had a sick partner at home. And those people have become increasingly cautious in the COVID period. And I think that you will see that a lot of older people are more likely to have postal votes. And also, while I was standing in a polling booth when I voted, watching the people who didn't take a barcode and go and vote electronically, and they tended to be older people.
Vicky Dunn, I know we're still early-ish in the count. Is it too early to say whether climate change has become an issue in some of these seats where we're seeing surprises and action on it? Because that is a big debate internationally, nationally and locally, and we know that it's a discussion in the ACT about what to do and when to do it. Aside from the 1 million trees guarantee from Alistair Coe, there wasn't much about energy policy, renewable energy in detail from your party. Could that be starting to bite here?
Well, I mean, a couple of things in that, Adam. I think that climate change is more of an issue in what might be called the lentil belt in Kurrajong.
I prefer Green Heartland.
We use them as
you would
synonyms.
call it that. But also, I think that it doesn't bite as much in West Belconnen and Southern Tuggeranong as it does.
Unless you reflect on the bushfires of this season just gone and the smoke that rolled in, and whether that focused people's minds.
But also that there's a fair amount of agreement across the board, and there's already been a fair amount of work done in terms of renewable energy. If you have a 100% renewable energy target that everyone's signed up to, then a lot of that work has been done. And I think that we, in many ways, took the environment in a different direction because we consider that there's tripartisan support for those issues in the energy space, and so that where you actually can make big changes is in transport. And we spoke a lot about public transport. Now, we don't agree about the solution to public transport in the same way that the Labor and the Greens do. And taking the 1 million trees was an important thing because, you know, the impact of deforestation and the loss of the tree canopy in the ACT is very important about, you know, your house is going to be harder to cool in the summertime if you have fewer trees. And that was the crux of that approach.
All right, well, there's the environmental debate in a neat little nutshell of about 2 minutes, but it has also ticked us over into the second hour of our coverage on ACT Votes 2020. It's just gone 7 o'clock, 7:03 to be precise, so our coverage continues. Shimmering under a kaleidoscope of colour inside the National Museum of Australia, the Aussie Dream Machine. The combination FJ Holden and the Propert Trailaway Touring Caravan of 1956, a combo that put the road trip holiday in the great outdoors within reach for post-World War II Australian families. The FJ, of course, built at Fisherman's Bend in Victoria, and that particular model that is now resident in the National Museum belonged to one Mary Goodall of Queanbeyan, just across the border. They're not part of ACT Votes, but no doubt they are taking some interest in what's happening here at present. Well, we have elections happening not just here at present, but also in New Zealand. For those not familiar, our chief election analyst, Anthony Green, has an all-black button, an extra one down the bottom right-hand side of his screen, and it's through that Anthony is tracking numbers from New Zealand.
And I think there's as much extra time in the results as there was in the Rugby League Union last week. The Labor Party, 65 seats. It's dropped one, but 50% of the vote, we've got 1.4 million votes counted. There's 3.5 million voters in New Zealand. Again, this is mostly the advanced votes. If there's some difference between the advanced and on the days, then I think that could come down. But still, it's very hard to see how Labor doesn't end up with a majority out of those numbers when you've got basically half the votes counted and they're on 65. And to come under 50%, that'd be a big drop in on-the-day votes. So I think it looks like Jacinda Ardern, without looking hugely into the numbers, I think she's got a majority, and there's no doubt about that. And even if she doesn't, the Greens got 8.1% and 11 seats. The National, they don't call it the Nationals, it's National in New Zealand, 34 seats. And the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, not the ACT in Australia, have got 10 seats. So at the moment, Labor's on track for majority government, and this would be the first majority government since MMP was introduced. Yeah, and we're talking about brand name politicians, Anthony. So what Winston Peters giveth, he then multiplies and giveth again. So he gave her government, Jacinda Ardern, but now he's given, in all likelihood, majority government. Yeah, Winston Peters has been written off many times now over the last 50 years of his political career, but in his mid-70s, I suspect that this might be his last, his final farewell in politics. Yep. Yeah. OK, so back to ACT votes, and there is one electorate we have not visited so far. That is the seat of Yerrabi, based principally up around Gungahlin and associated districts. So, Anthony, let's address that anomaly and take a look at what you've got for Yerrabi. It's queued up first off just to do the overall votes for the territory. Right? 38.8 for the Labor Party, 34 for the Liberals, 14 for the Greens, 12.8 for others. And just to clarify again, it's a very low count for Yerrabi and Ginninderra at this stage. So the two northern electorates got a very low count. If we look at Yerrabi on the numbers we've got at the moment, I think it's only... It's 20. Well, look, suddenly it's gone from 1.2 to 29. Yes, this is what happens. The Liberals got 2.5 on these numbers, way better than anywhere else. The Labor Party 2.1 and the Greens 0.5. That is quite remarkable. Let's have a look at the leaders and see what happens. Alistair Coe has only got one quota, 0.56 for Leanne Castley. James Milligan on 0.48. So depending on how the others all go and how the preferences flow, there's a chance the Liberals could get 3 in Yerrabi, which is at odds with what we've seen elsewhere. So we'll see what happens. Michael Pedersen is leading on 0.6, Susan Orr on 0.45, Deepak Raj Gupta, who was elected at the recount, he's the third place candidate there. Just let me look at those party totals again. That's 2.53 for the Liberals, 2.1 for Labor. In that case, Deepak Raj Gupta would probably be defeated, and 0.53 for the Greens. But that's a potential third seat for the Liberals, which I didn't expect to see. Well, this is going in all sorts of confounding and, in some senses, contradictory directions. We'll discuss that with our panel soon. We also want to speak to Mick Gentleman, MLA, from Brindabella very shortly. So, Anthony, before we do that, why don't we
pop back down to Brindabella. We haven't been there for 15, 20 minutes or so, and see what is the latest from the southernmost electorate. Anthony?
2.47 quotas for Labor, 2.32 for the Liberals, and 0.65 for the Greens. On those figures, it would be more likely between Labor and the Greens for the final seat, but let's look at the actual candidates. Joy Birch on 0.7 will be elected, Mark Parton, Nicole Lauder and Mick Gentleman. They're all on above 0.6, and the way preferences work, they will all be elected. Beyond that, it's between Tamus Werder-Gibbings, Andrew Wall and Jonathan Davis from the Greens for that final spot. There's no clear trend yet on those numbers. More counting to come, plus the preference distribution. But at the moment, Joy Birch, Mark Parton, Nicole Lauder and Mick Gentleman have been elected, we consider.
All right, well, that will be music to the ears of Mick Gentleman, I'm sure. Although, Mick, you do have Tamus Werner-Gibbings snapping at your heels there. I'm going to assume that you're not counting anything as in the bag just yet.
No, not just yet. It's very early in the count, and I'm very grateful for the support that we see in Brindabella for ALP. And of course, over the last 4 years, we have been investing in that electorate as well, both in terms of what Brindabella people like, and that is our environment, but also in police and emergency services support we provided for the electorate during the bushfires, I think is quite important. And I've had that come back to me on the door knocking, which we've been doing a lot of. You can see a bit of colour in my face from the sunshine recently. So really want to thank the people for Brindabella for their support, and we'll continue to invest in that electorate, as we've said during this campaign. More upgrades for infrastructure around Lake Tuggeranong, more for the lake itself. Of course, school upgrades as well. More police on the street, more emergency services in our firefighters, and of course our paramedics as well.
Better slip, slop, slap next time, Mick Gentleman. Just on incumbency through COVID times and through the bushfires, which you referenced. That was obviously a very challenging time for this greater capital region, but politically, was that a fortunate outcome for you and your team in Brindabella?
I wouldn't use those terms at all, no. I think we all did the job that we were expected to do. Our emergency services agency were absolutely fantastic. Georgina Whelan as the Commissioner, but particularly our volunteers out on the fireground, supporting the safety of Canberrans in the south, I think was well received, and we'll continue, of course, to invest in our ESA. The fire season this year looks a little easier, which is pleasing to everybody, I think, but it is very important to keep that investment going, and that's what we're going to do.
I think you're right. To an individual, every Canberran is very proud of the work that emergency services workers, rescue workers and the like did through this really challenging year. But politically, did that make your job to try and get re-elected easier?
Oh, no, we've been working very hard, as I said, and we've been on the doors, on the phone calls at shopping centres right through this campaign. I think Canberrans wanted to see a safe pair of hands, and I think this is what this government has been providing for them, both through the bushfire season and, of course, the storm season now into COVID as well. You've seen a steady hand at the tiller, and I think we're seeing a response from that.
If Brindabella is at this stage a better story for Labor, Yerrabee looks like a difficult one. What do you put that down to when light rail has been delivered there and presumably people in that electorate have been benefiting from it?
Oh, I think it's something that I need to look at. I haven't seen the numbers for Yerrabee, or even the full count for Brindabella isn't concluded yet, so we're still a way off, and I won't make any forecasts into why that's occurred and how it will come out at the end of the night.
But I'm not talking about a forecast here. With about a quarter of the vote counted in Yerrabee, there seems to be a strong move away from Labor. I'm wondering if you have had a read as a minister on why that might be.
No, I haven't, Adam. No, I've been concentrating in my electorate during this campaign, so I haven't had a look at the results for Yerrabee yet.
Mick, gentlemen, it sounds like things are optimistic in your neck of the woods. We'll see how the rest of it unfolds across the ACT. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks very much.
OK, so a bit to pick through as we see the overall vote count in ACT Votes 2020. as I glance towards my dashboard, hovering at around 28%. So that's territory-wide. Yes, there are disparities between the 5 individual electorates, but we're climbing into the business part of the night here, and there are a few intriguing stories. Rachel Stevens-Smith, Yerrabee is the one that's blown me away, because you go to build them a tram line, you go to 3-4 years later, they look like going to the other guys. This is shaky.
Oh, well, I think it comes back to someone mentioned earlier, the leader of the Liberals is now in Yerrabee, whereas previously was in Murrumbidgee, and we've seen how that has shaped out in Murrumbidgee, that it appears on the earlier numbers that Jeremy Hansen's vote has dropped and not having so much profile, and Alistair Coe's seems to have increased on the numbers that we've got at the moment, having that profile as leader. But of course, we also lost Megan Fitzharris when she resigned from the Assembly. She was a very high profile Minister for Health, Minister for Transport, the person who delivered light rail for Yerrabee, and very well known and very well liked in the electorate.
So why weren't efforts redoubled then with the remaining field of incumbents? You can talk about the 5 ticket members if you like, but particularly the incumbent MLAs, to get them going in Megan's absence?
Look, I think there's a number of things going on. Michael Pedersen and Deepak Rajgupta, their field campaign has been extraordinary. They have been right up the top of all of our candidates the whole way through the year, making calls, and as soon as we're allowed to door knock, going out door knocking. So they have spoken to a lot of people. Suzanne Orr, I think, has a very, very strong representation for particularly the areas of Yerrabee that she grew up in and that she lives in, and she's a really great local member. But she also had what can be a disadvantage, and Chris Burke experienced this last time, of becoming a minister just coming into the campaign year. So you're learning to be a minister, you're getting across your portfolios, you get a different type of profile, but it's hard to get out and do that on the ground campaigning just as you've become a minister.
All right, well, Vicky Dunn, how much of that would you ascribe to not so much the ministerial distraction argument, but the idea that Alistair Coe is instrumental in pulling off something that could be quite remarkable in Yerrabee?
Well, I mean, the thing is that before we started tonight, that's what we needed to see in Yerrabee, but we also needed to see that in Brindabella and Kurrajong and Murrumbidgee, and we don't seem to be seeing what we hope to see in Brindabella and Kurrajong, but we're seeing it in Brindabella. And I think that it's a combination of things. There is always the leader's premium. You see with, Andrew, although there's a swing away from Labor in Kurrajong, a small swing, Andrew's vote is up there. You would expect that Al would get the lion's share of those votes there. And I think that puts us confident. I mean, 38% doesn't give us three quotas, but it depends how many votes waste and things like that. But it's a very strong campaign. It's a very strong campaign from all of the 5 candidates there, but really, Alistair, James Milligan and Leanne Casterly has run a stellar campaign there as well.
Shane Rattenbury, there's that analysis, which is candidate-based. I'm just wondering if there's not a broader story there about an ACT divided, north-south flipping of circumstances. Can you bring any sense to that at all?
It's an interesting point, Greg. I mean, I think in 2016, Yerrabee was the battleground. Light rail was the polarising issue of the 2016 election, and it really was a referendum on whether we'd build light rail or not. And the Liberal Party took a clear position that they intended to rip up the contract. And so I think 2016 you saw Gungahlin and really say, yeah, we do want this tram. We want light rail built to our area. We need better transport. And I suspect they really got behind the Labor Party in 2016. We might just be seeing a sort of a levelling out here. Add that to having Alistair Coe as your leader in that electorate. But yes, your interesting point, because the South has been seen as the Liberal Party stronghold and the North has been seen as the Labor Party stronghold. And there does appear at this stage to be a flip of that.
To me, this adds to the presumptions you can't make about Canberra and the ACT. I think we're a region that is built to bust stereotypes. This is evidence of it. And I will also make the point that Yerrabee was always the potential swing state, if you could put it that way, within an ACT context. You're talking about a rapidly growing population that is diversifying quite quickly. the Liberals made a concerted and I think a good effort to reflect that in their candidates in areas like Yerrabee, so people felt seen and represented. Also, on Leanne Castley, she ran in the federal election just recently. She made a good ground campaign at that point and is clearly capitalising on a bit of name recognition and more hard work on the ground. So in some ways, and I don't want to sound contrarian, but I'm not necessarily super surprised at what's happening in Yerrabee, because you're talking about a region that is growing so fast with a diversity of electorate, and there will be, well, fits and starts in who supports who through that growth and that emergence, that evolution of a region like it.
Yep, reasonable analysis as ever from Adam Shirley, and we'll be revisiting the questions around Yerrabee a bit later. Shane's almost suggesting, whether he meant it or not, that there might be something quite transactional here about what voters look for, they receive, and then they go elsewhere. You know, we'll pull that apart as the night goes on. But the night is ploughing onwards and upwards towards 30% of the vote counted, so why not go back to our Chief Election Analyst, Anthony Green. Anthony, with a summary at the outset.
We'll look at the, I didn't want that, I wanted the primary vote. We've got 28% counted. It's about 45 in Brindabella, about 30 in Currajong, Murrumbidgee and Yerrabee, but it's only 4% in Ginninderra for some reason. But 38.8 for Labor, 34 for the Liberal Party, 14 for the Greens, 12.8 for others. And if we have a look at the change in vote that's occurred, the Labor votes up a little, Liberals down, Greens up, others down 1.7. I'd have to go and look at the figures for Yerrabee, but those figures, just to say, Alistair Coe's got one quota. It's not a huge figure for a leader. It's actually some of the other candidates on the ticket have attracted votes. It's not all his increase. So it's not him dragging the vote in for him. It seems the Liberal vote is up generically, but that may be a construct of the electronic votes. We'll have to have a look. But at this stage, that's what it looks like. And if we have just a quick look at the chamber, the seats we're definitely giving away is we are giving, no, that's the last election. When the seats won, we're giving Labor 10 and the Greens 1 and the Liberals 8. So the Labor and the Greens need another 2 seats to continue in government. But at the moment, Ginninderra, we haven't given much in Ginninderra, and there's a lot more counting to come in some of these seats.
All right, so still 6 seats unaccounted for, but that's what Anthony's at this stage in the evening. We've been hearing from Shane Rattenbury, but we're also going to hear in just a moment from his counterpart in Rebecca Vassarotti, who's standing by. She's in the Currajong electorate alongside Shane Rattenbury as a running mate. So why don't we, Anthony, before speaking to Rebecca Vassarotti, take another look at latest from Currajong.
It's funny when you're doing an election like this and here in Currajong you've got something which looks nothing like in Yerrabee next door. Much more. You may expect expect a little more homogeneity over the ACT. We're not seeing on the figures at the moment. Maybe it's a construct of election. Up to 43.9. It's a big jump since our last look. Labor's on 2.3. The Liberals on 1.66. The Greens on 1.3. So the Liberal vote has come up because they were in third place a little while back. If we look at where the votes are, Andrew Barr's got 1.3 quotas, so he will be elected. Shane Rattenbury, 0.77, will be elected. Elizabeth Lee, as a sitting member and leading the Liberal ticket, will be elected. And Candice Birch, as a sitting MP, is the next most likely if the Liberals get to the second seat. Rebecca Vassarotti, 0.36, not as high as she was earlier. She was the fourth place candidate a bit earlier. But at the moment, to go back to those party totals, what we're seeing is the Labor Party's on 2.3, a definite 2 seats. The Liberals are on 1.66, the Greens on 1.339. So they both have 1 seat. And if the Liberal vote continues at around that level, I would expect they would win the second seat. Though there are some parties like the Canberra Progressives with 5% of the vote there. They only have, I think, 3 candidates. So there will be preferences flow out of the ticket. And it will be interesting to see where those votes go.
All right, so some improvement in the Liberal vote there since the last batch of votes that Anthony was able to bring us from Currajong. But just to take a look now at the Liberal running mate to leader Shane Rattenbury, Rebecca Vassarotti from Currajong is joining us from the Greens function in the suburb of Turner at the Polish Club there. Rebecca, it's a solid personal campaign you've run, possibly at the expense of Shane Rattenbury. Am I seeing the makings of a succession plan here somewhere?
Look, the
the Greens campaign was absolutely a team campaign. We were really clear that we were in this as a team. And so, you know, we've had an extraordinary contribution from Shane, and we were really keen to show the Kurrajong voters that we had a strong team and a really good, good range of people that could represent the community.
Rebecca Vassarotti, this is not your first crack at an election, but it's a stronger result than you've had previously. What is the reasoning in your mind for that? Perhaps what some voters have told you anecdotally as well?
Well, look, this is a very different campaign, and we really understood that we had a lot to offer the Kurrajong and the Canberra community. This is a campaign that we've had a really strong policy platform. We've delivered a really strong vision to the community in terms of the Canberra that we want to see in the future, and not going back to where we were before, but creating a better normal. We've had hundreds of volunteers that have been working really hard. So again, I go back to the fact that this really is a team effort. But certainly voters are really talking to us about they want to see candidates and people in the Assembly that really represent the community. And we've been really lucky to be, able to, have people involved that are really connected to our local community and have been involved in a lot of things. So I think we're seeing the results of some of that.
Some of the major concerns around the incumbent Labor minority government with the Greens have been around health delivery, have been around buses when it comes to public transport. Did you receive much critique or concern from the people you spoke with about those issues?
Look, what we really heard throughout the campaign is the Greens can play a really constructive role in government. I think voters really look to the Greens to really push governments to do better. And I think we've seen both with Shane and Caroline in this last Assembly have really done that. And so there was a real hunger that we heard from voters to actually see more of that happen. And so I think that also, represents that we are seeing, an increase in the Greens vote. We don't know how it will go. It's still really early days, but we're really hopeful that we could play a much stronger role in the Assembly, because we do really play that constructive role that really does, push governments to do better, to think more ambitiously, and really look at the issues that matter to community.
And with 44% of the vote counted in Kurrajong to this point, 5% of that vote has gone to the Canberra Progressives. Did you or did the Greens HQ have any discussions about how to coordinate your efforts, perhaps to harvest some of that votes through the preferences that Anthony mentioned earlier?
Well, look, the great thing about Hare Clark is that it is actually up to the voters about where they direct their preferences. Certainly the Progressives had a lot of similarities within our policy, within the policies and some of the things that they were talking about. So, we would be really hopeful that voters do see that, that if they have looked to the Progressives, that they will look to preference us. But this is one of the beauties of Hare Clark, that we actually put it in the hands of the voters so they can decide where their vote goes, rather than it being backdoor conversations between parties.
We'll see if some of that spillover benefits you personally or the party more broadly. Rebecca Vassarotti, we appreciate your time tonight.
Lovely to speak to you.
Now, whenever we get to that point where 44%, let's call it, roughly half of the vote is counted, you're entering a zone where some calls can be made with a little more certainty. And that's really an invitation for the ABC's chief election analyst, Anthony Green, to do his magic now with the numbers he has. Anthony, I think we might start with an overview first of all, and then, well, let's not. We can go straight into an individual seat. How is Ginninderra looking? Because it was a bit slow out of the blocks when it came to vote counts.
22% now. The Labor Party's on 2.45 quotas. The Liberals on 1.61, the Greens 0.71, the Belcourt Party on 0.58. On those numbers, you've got 2 Labor, you've got 1 Liberal, and then there would either be a Labor or a Green candidate, and then the last spot would be either Liberal or the Belcourt Party, but there's a fair bit more counting to come there. And when you look at the candidates that are there, Yvette Berry's got a quota and is elected, 0.6 for Gordon Ramsay, 0.55 for Tara Shane. Both of them have had an advantage of over half a quota to start with. So they will stay in the count a long time, pick up preferences. And so from 2.45 quotas, the Labor Party would be well placed to get to 3, I think, on these numbers. The Liberals have got 0.58, 0.37, 0.27. There's a lot of preferences got to be distributed before Elizabeth Kickett gets to her majority, which makes it much harder for the second Liberal because there might be some leakage out of the ticket. Plus, when you've got Bill Stefaniak there on 0.22, that's we're going to look at the preference counts on that one. That's a long time. The Liberal vote, the Green vote, has not concentrated on one candidate, which is probably bad news for the Greens. So it's only 22%. Every other electorate's got more than twice on that at the moment. But again, if I just go back at the party totals there again, you're looking at the Labor Party on 2.5. And let's look at the change in vote since last time. It's the Liberal vote that's dropped and the Belcourt Party on 8.5%. So that's the shift that's occurred in that electorate. The Labor Party vote is unchanged and they got 3%, 3 seats on that total last time. And the Green vote's only up slightly.
Yeah, so the Belcourt Party was seen as, by some, perhaps unfairly, as a Liberal offshoot, if only because it was Bill Stefaniak who was heading it there. There might be some dissent on our panel. Vicky Dunn can tell us about that a little later, that interesting phenomenon to see that that's where their votes have drifted in 2020. Anthony Murrumbidgee, much spoken about earlier. Why don't we revisit that too?
We've now got 62% counted. Labor's got 2.2 quotas. They have 2 seats. The Liberals have 2.11. Remember, there were wards over 2.5 quotas last time, and that put them in the race with the Greens for the final seat. But on those numbers, that's not going to be a race between the Liberals and Labor for the last seat. That will be a Green seat. The one oddity is the 0.45 with the ungrouped candidates. And we can see that when we look at the leaders. Jeremy Hanson has been re-elected, Chris Steele re-elected. Marisa Patterson is ahead of Beck Cody, who's a sitting member. So if it's possible that Beck Cody will not get back. You often get a lot of transfers between female candidates by voters, but they're both women. They're both female women. So Tim Dobson and Brendan Long are the other 2 Labor candidates. I'm not sure if there's a factional reason why they might favour one or the other, but at the moment, Beck Cody is in danger of losing her seat. Emma Davidson is leading the Green ticket. She's in 4th place at the moment. 0.71 is the overall total, so those Green preferences have to stay within the ticket. And then there's Fiona Carrick. I can't see how she's got 0.41, 6.9%. It's a very, very good result for a candidate in the ungrouped column. But if you're in the ungrouped column, you need preferences from somewhere, and I don't think there's anywhere that's going to give her preferences to be in the race to catch up with the Greens on 0.7 or any of the Labor candidates on over half a quota. So to me, that looks like 2 Labor, 2 Liberal, strong chance of a Greens at this stage in Murrumbidgee.
Yep, so that's a consolidation story or a repetitious story almost in Murrumbidgee, if that's the way it plays. Why don't we now, before getting some thoughts from our panel in just a moment, go back, Anthony, and take a look at the electorate that had some heads spinning only 15 to 20 minutes ago. I was going to take us to Yerrabee, but do you want to...
I forgot to mention something. Jeremy Hanson's got 0.9, but Julia Jones is the other sitting Liberal MP. Yep. She's only just ahead of 2 other Liberal candidates. Now, she's not going to get a flow on from Jeremy Hanson as she did last time. Remember, he got over 20% of the vote last time as the leader. And remember also last time in Murrumbidgee, there were only 2 sitting members and they were both Liberals. There was no sitting Labor MP, there was no Greens MP. So I think that maybe explains why the Liberal vote has dropped, because Jeremy Hanson hasn't had the same profile. Plus, there's been more competition. But yeah, I just forgot to mention that Julia Jones is down here amongst the other Liberal candidates. So there's a lot of counting to come there. Yerrabee was the electorate we were talking about. I thought I'd better go back and clear it up. 44% now. The Liberal vote started to drop down, 2.43. Labor on 2.11. The Greens on 0.49. The Labor Party, the DLP on 2.8, 2.28 quotas. They had column 1 on the ballot paper. The Labor, DLP and the Liberal Democrats, when they appear on the left-hand side of the ballot paper, always do better when they're to the left of the major party than they are to the right. And so if Labor loses some votes, they'll point to the Labor Party DLP there. Dave Pollard has run a couple of times, an independent has his own group this time, and it's 3% of the vote. If we look at the leaders' votes, Alistair Coe slipped under a quota. The last leader to not get a quota was Wayne Berry. Just sort of drop that in there. Alistair Coe, 0.95. Michael Pedersen on 0.58. Leanne Castley is second on the Liberal ticket, ahead of James Milligan. And she's doing quite well against James Milligan. So there's another possibility of a sitting member being defeated there. It's a matter of how much of the Liberal quota how much the Liberal vote stays above 2 quotas. Suzanne Orr on 0.5. If the Labor Party only win 2, I think that Michael Pedersen and Suzanne Orr would be favoured and Deepak Raj Gupta would lose his seat. So 44.5, that's probably all the electronic votes. We should get a distribution of preferences on some of these seats soon. But that's up to date with everything we've got at the moment.